My name is Chelsea Baker, and I'll be the convener for this session, Open Pages, Open Minds, Navigating Freedom of Expression in Canadian Libraries. I'm the librarian at the Central Quebec School Board in Quebec City. Our board office is on the traditional territory of the Wendat Nation of Wendake, who have been the stewards of the land and waters here since the Wendat Confederacy of 1650, and whose rights are protected under the Murray Treaty and the Great War Belt of the Wendat Wampum. The chat will be open throughout this session, and questions will be relayed to the speakers at the end of the presentation. As library staff and educators, we understand the impact that freedom of expression has on fostering critical thinking, creativity, and empathy in our communities. It is a pleasure for me to introduce three people who champion access to books, who are passionate about students and learning, and who have excelled in advocating for vibrant, well-staffed library spaces. They will be guiding us in a discussion on the state of freedom of expression in Canada and how book challenges, how intellectual freedom issues are affecting our school communities. Even if you have never had a book challenge, or if you've never had to explain your book purchasing choices to an administrator, feeling prepared for any situation is key. Please give a warm welcome to our speakers, Michelle Arbuckle, Executive Director of the Ontario Library Association, Anita Kirkland, Chair of Canadian School Libraries, and Michael Nyby, Chair of the Canadian Federation of Library Associations Intellectual Freedom Committee. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having us today. My name is Michelle Arbuckle. I'm going to take us through the first part of our talk. We have divided our talk up into three parts. So I'm going to start speaking a little bit about some foundational concepts about what freedom to read means and about freedom of expression in Canada. Michael's going to take us through the second part, reflecting more on what's currently happening in the state of the country and the state of challenges across our sector. And then Anita's going to take us home in the final bit, focusing on school library context. Okay, so my agenda for our talk today is just to give us a bit of a historical context and an overview of what freedom of expression means. And we're going to start off with some definitions. I'm going to talk a little bit about freedom of expression in Canada and how it all kicked off, how Freedom to Read Week kicked off about 40 years ago. We're going to talk about some foundational concept of what challenges mean. And then, most importantly, I think what you can do, and it wouldn't be a talk to educators if we didn't leave with a little bit of homework in the end. So first, let's start by talking about definitions. It's always a good place to start a conversation, just to ensure that we're all talking about the same thing. And as with most culture in Canada, we are often influenced by that which occurs to the south of us, much of the culture. And that can certainly be said when it comes to books and to reading and issues like what we're discussing today. Now, America recognizes Banned Books Week in October and Canada Freedom to Read Week in February. And there is a slight difference in tone to those campaigns. We do use different words to talk about them. Canadian libraries primarily refer to challenges because it's important to note even when a library material has been flagged or challenged in a community, although not necessarily banned or removed from a library system. Library neutrality is another term to keep an eye out for. There's much literature about this concept. I'd encourage you to seek it out and to read through it. Much of that reflects on the idea that neutrality doesn't really exist as most people speak to that word, nor has it ever existed in libraries. Even the idea of providing free access to reading materials, it's not neutral. The idea of allowing anyone, regardless of socioeconomic standing in society, into a space to access materials freely, that is not neutral. What we're talking about and what we're striving for really in libraries is balance. So collecting materials of all perspectives and all viewpoints, that's what we would call balanced collection. Balanced library collection is the goal of most collection development policies, which would provide us with a broad and wide perspective to a number of different voices and opinions. What I'm showing on the screen right now is an image from the Freedom to Read Week website. This is a timeline, 40 years of freedom of expression in Canada. This is a resource freely available on the website, and it outlines some of the major milestones around freedom of expression over the past 40 years. I highly recommend reading through the timeline. I find it incredibly helpful to know that this is not a new issue for us, that educators, librarians, writers, publishers have been fighting this fight for decades. And in order to best prepare ourselves for these conversations and for the inevitable challenges that may occur, it's so important to look at what we've accomplished in the past and how history frequently repeats itself. So at a very high level, let's talk about this campaign of Freedom to Read Week in Canada and how it all got started. Appropriately enough, it did start in school libraries. In 1976, complaints were made in 2 Ontario high schools about The Diviners by Margaret Laurence. And at that time, the Ontario Ministry of Education had given local school boards the authority to determine which works could be used in their English classes. So complaints were directed at that time to a special committee, which was part of the ministry, for review. In this case, 2 men from the community were behind the complaints. Jim Telford was a Board of Education trustee. He was also a member of the Pentecostal community. The other person behind the complaints was Reverend Sam Buick. And they opposed this book and told the Globe and Mail that it reeked of sordidness. Now, the committee from the ministry that reviewed did not agree, gave its unanimous support to retain the material at the start of this complaint in 1976. But despite that ruling, only one school continued to teach this book, The Diviners. And that is a trend that we continue to see and to monitor in school libraries. School Library Journal reported in their recent controversial book survey that 14% of schools indicate that they simply will not purchase titles that have been challenged by other systems because it's too much of a headache and they're worried about any issues that might pop up based on those other challenges. This is what we would refer to as shadow banning, and I'm going to speak more about that in a few slides. But suffice it to say, we thank Margaret Laurence for writing this incredible book. It went through 9 years of battles stemming from these organized religious groups. So to set the stage for the main piece of my talk today, I'm going to go through some what I would consider foundational areas. What is a challenge? When is a challenge justified? Who is behind most of these challenges? What happens when a challenge occurs? And then what I would consider, I would consider those the foundational pieces, and many of you might be already versed in many of those areas. I think it's really important for us to reflect back on those basics because it does help us with our ongoing understanding of the issues that are at play through these challenges. But what I would consider to be most important pieces are why you should defend challenged materials and what you can do to get involved and to learn more. So what is a challenge? A challenge is any attempt to censor, remove, or restrict access to a publication so that people cannot access it themselves. And challenges occur in schools and in libraries of all types, but they do also occur in courts and at borders between countries. Some of you may not know there's a document. The Canadian government regularly puts out a report on materials that are seized at borders. Now, these aren't challenges. This is the restricting, the pulling of material at the border. But it's a really interesting read. For the past several years, those seizures have primarily been hate literature and child pornography. But for libraries, typically challenges are part of a process, part of a collections development policy. And that is a process that is followed when a member of your community would like to challenge materials. And if you don't already know your policy around this, around how your school, how your library would deal with an issue, I would say run, don't walk to figure out how you can either find that policy or get that policy created. So why do people challenge books? There's a number of reasons why materials are challenged. I'm not going to spend too much time here because Michael is going to elaborate more on the state of challenges in Canada. But this is a graphic from the Freedom to Read Week resources on our website, outlines all the various ways why people challenge books. And in today's talk, we're going to make reference to Canada's, the Canadian Library Challenges database, and I'll put the link in the chat as well. And through this database, you can view the status of challenges in libraries across the country. You can see what's been challenged, how that library responded to that challenge, and when the challenge was made. I find it incredibly informative, insightful, has helped much of my practice. So I recommend you take a look at that when you get a chance. But complaints can come from anyone in your community. In your case, it can come from students, from other teachers, from administrators, parents, parent councils. And something that we're facing more and more now are what I would call organized bad faith challenges. We see this occurring in the United States quite a bit, but increasingly it has been affecting us in Canada as well. And this means we have organized groups, not necessarily from our communities, seeking to remove materials based on their own agenda. So in many cases, having never read the book and also trying to work outside of the systems we have in place and the policies that we have in place. When is a challenge justified? These are a few points that I like to make when talking about challenges, but really, when a challenge is justified depends on your library's selection policy or your collections policy. School libraries select and deselect in a slightly different way than public or academic libraries might. And there are certainly times when a challenge is justified. And when that occurs, the materials can be handled in a few different ways. So when material is challenged in a library, the way that material is then handled can range from no change at all the way to its removal from the collection. But in between, there are various ends of the spectrum. So the book could be reclassified. It could be shelved in a different section of your collection, of your library. A label could be placed on the book as a form of content warning. Or, as we've unfortunately heard from several schools, the material could be removed from public access, sometimes being moved to a drawer in the principal's office or somewhere out of reach, somewhere that requires a student to request the material specifically or to justify their need to see it. So why should we defend challenged materials? Firstly, I want to note, and this is really important, that defending freedom to read does not mean that you support sexism, racism, or hatred. But I do want to be real with you, and I like to talk about this during these talks because there are a lot of social justice issues at play when we talk about our collections now. We're learning more and more about how equity and diversity and inclusivity impacts our collections. And sometimes defending freedom of expression doesn't feel great. It feels kind of gross. It doesn't make you feel like you're always the hero. There's a bit of an ick factor. And dealing with that uncomfortable gross factor, I'm sorry, that sounds so crass, but it stems out of defending the opinions of people who differ from yours, whose opinions are different from yours, and who you don't agree with. And that can be challenging, but it is really important to understand that. So there are a few points here that I'd like you to consider when you come across that. Firstly, when you're defending challenged materials, focus on the principles, not personal feelings. So emphasize the importance of protecting everyone's right to express themselves, even if you disagree with their opinions or if you find them offensive. By upholding principles of free speech, you're defending the fundamental values of democracy, diversity, and tolerance, regardless of individual beliefs. Second one, engage in constructive dialogue and debate. I think this is such an important concept, particularly among this group of educators. Encouraging open-mindedness and willingness to listen to differing perspectives is really important. Encourage your students to try to understand the reasoning behind opposing viewpoints and be prepared to offer counter-arguments based on evidence and reason. And this kind of civil dialogue fosters intellectual growth, also fosters empathy, mutual respect, even in the face of disagreement. And the third, of course, support a diverse and inclusive discourse. And I want to be very clear that defending freedom of expression and having these types of conversation does not mean endorsing hate speech or discriminatory speech. And it's really important to know the definitions of legal speech. A few last thoughts on why I think this is so important, particularly for all of you working with young people. Removing or hiding materials interferes with the ability for your students to grow into informed and intelligent members of society, the ability to grow into someone capable of having empathy and understanding the experiences of other people. Having conversations around the discomfort that we feel around some of this material is a much more productive way of dealing with these issues and of allowing us to practice critical thinking. So what can you do? Well, you're here today. How many of us are here? I can't see that right now. 68 of us are here. So thank you all for choosing this session. You are choosing to be informed, and I encourage you to continue learning more about this issue and reflecting on your own professional values. You can get involved or get your schools involved. Run a Freedom to Read Week campaign in February. Make sure the students understand the history of challenges and censorship in their country and how history does often repeat itself. And finally, be prepared, because as much as we like to separate ourselves from the rhetoric in America, we know that these strategies will end up crossing the border and affecting all of us. So know your policies, have the conversation with your administrators, get people comfortable talking about the issues and the importance of the right to read and access information. So your homework, place your holds now. These are 3 books that I highly recommend to understand more about the history of book challenges and book bans across the world. Read Dangerously by Azar Nafisi. She is the writer of Reading Lolita in Tehran. Burning the Books by Richard Ovenden, and Dangerous Ideas by Eric Berkowitz. These are all excellent books that help to contextualize this issue, that talk about the history of incidences where information has been guarded or where information has been seen as the enemy, or in some way has been access has been removed for a certain agenda. So I highly recommend all 3 of those. I'm also a huge fan of podcasts. Tracy over at The Stacks ran a great series on banned books a few years ago. I've listened to each of these episodes several times and found them really helpful in my own understanding. I also find it really interesting to hear how non-library people talk about the impact of book banning. I think it's really, really informative. Highly recommend that series. Tracy speaks with students, which I find the student voice in this conversation so interesting. Also, librarians, teachers, and a number of authors who have had their works banned as well. I also highly recommend listening to this Ezra Klein Show podcast, which was an interview with Emily Drabinsky, who is the current ALA president. The title of that episode is America's Top Librarian on the Rise of Banned Books, on the rise of book bans. And Emily in that talk reflects on political and cultural anxieties that have been fueling the attacks on libraries in that country. It's a really, really excellent listen. She's an excellent speaker on this topic, so highly recommend that one as well. My name is Michelle Arbuckle. My contact information is there, and I just want to note, I've put my email there. Sometimes I know in groups like this, if you have a question that you think is silly or against the grain, or is for your own learning, but you don't want to ask it in a group, I can fully appreciate and understand that. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you ever have any questions or thoughts to help with your own evolution and learning in this area. I'm happy to chat with anyone at any time. And I'm going to pass the torch over to Michael now.
Thank you, Michelle. That was great. I just want to introduce myself. My name is Michael Nyby. Can everybody hear me okay here? Okay, great. Had some mic issues yesterday, but apparently it's fine now. I am the chair of the CFLA-FCAB Intellectual Freedom Committee, and I am the librarian at the W. Ross Macdonald School for the Blind in Brantford, Ontario. I would like to talk a little bit about the data that we have collected on book challenges and attempted book bans in Canada, or just intellectual freedom challenges in general, And I want to talk about what we can learn from that data, what it tells us about the challenges that are happening now, and what information the data provides that can help us fight against this wave of censorship that we're experiencing right now. Now, you should be seeing a poll come up on Zoom fairly shortly. On that poll, just a few questions about whether or not you have experienced any challenges in your libraries. And this could be, if your library has a system where somebody can submit a form, a request for reconsideration form, that counts. It could be parents who have sent angry emails about something that their students have, that their children have checked out. It could be teachers or administrators coming to the library and complaining about materials or programming that you have had there. The next questions regard whether or not you have reported these challenges to the CFLA-FCAB or our affiliated organizations. And then the last one is if you are actually aware that you are able to do that. So have a moment to take a look at fill out that poll. So it looks like 33% of attendees here have experienced challenges in their libraries. Nobody has reported any, and about 42% were aware that they were able to report. This actually lines up really well with some of the data that we have collected. Most of the data that we've collected has come from public libraries, but I'm glad to see that the numbers seem to be fairly similar in school libraries. The issues that we are experiencing right now in our data collection efforts is really just awareness. A lot of libraries, as you can see here, almost 60% of libraries or attendees are not aware that this option of reporting was available to them. We find that that's about the same percentage of library workers across the country who are not aware of that this option is available to them. And even though 42% of you were aware, still nobody reported. And there are a lot of issues that may contribute to that low reporting rate as well. And we actually published a whole study specifically about that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, before we get into the data itself, I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges survey, how you can access it and how you can report the challenges that you're experiencing in your library. So on my first slide here, this is the Canadian Library Challenges database where you can view all the public data on library censorship that we have. Michelle already talked about this a little bit, so I won't dwell on it. But you can filter for library title, reasons for complaints. And many libraries, and I encourage you to do this if you do report, submit very rich descriptions, including quotations from the complainants themselves, and will often include letters or with all the identifying information redacted, letters or emails that they have sent back to the complainants explaining their decision. There is a link on this page that says completing this Google form. That will bring you to the reporting mechanism itself. You can also get to it by just going to the CFLA-FCAB webpage. Right smack dab in the center of it, we have a big banner link that will take you directly to the reporting form. This reporting form will anything that's reported via this reporting form will get on the public database within a few days. If you are concerned about anonymity, there is a link on the form to send an email to someone with the Center for Free Expression, who will then provide an anonymous reporting form to you. You may also submit in French on the ABPQ website. We have formed a partnership with them in this past year in order to better distribute the reporting mechanism throughout Quebec. And I just want to mention that any reports that come through the ABPQ form, those will by default be listed anonymously. Those will not show up in the public library database or public challenges database unless it is explicitly otherwise given consent by the reporter themselves. So once we've gotten that out of the way, I want to talk about the data itself. To start, this is a general overview of the top challenge categories from the 2015 to 2021 7-year time period. I'm giving you this information to provide a baseline of reference so you can see how severely things have changed in the last couple of years. So what we are seeing here are the top 8 challenges by frequency that we had reported to us over that 7-year period. The most common challenge type was challenges to materials that were perceived to be racist. The majority of these 51 challenges were to materials that appeared to be anti-Indigenous in nature. And it's worth pointing out here that the Truth and Reconciliation Report was released in 2015, and that may have had some effect on why this was the dominant or the most common type of challenge that we saw. In close second, there were challenges to sexually explicit material, and I want to note importantly that this does not include material that was challenged for LGBTQ themes. This was just general sexual content. We had 24 challenges to materials that were perceived to be queer-phobic and to materials deemed to be inappropriate for their age group. The inappropriate for a target audience or inappropriate for age group category, that was a kind of catch-all for materials where there was no clear indication that there was another reason or a more specific reason that they were being challenged. And now we're going to note that the pro-LGBTQ titles received fewer challenges than queer-phobic titles over this time period. And that was followed by inaccurate information. General hate speech with, again, if there was no clear reason for what kind of hate speech it was, it would ended up in this sort of catch-all category. For instance, we had one challenge that was challenged because it was deemed hate speech against capitalists, which to my knowledge are not a protected class in Canada. And then the last one on this list is violent content. So now that we have that baseline, we've gone through the numbers, let's look at current trends. Almost immediately after that earlier reference period ended, things started to change dramatically and honestly rendering findings that we had obsolete if we were trying to predict trends. Starting in 2020, we had rise of groups like Moms for Liberty in the US, and they influenced some Canadian analogs. And I'll mention a few of them that were cited specifically in the challenge reports that we got. They include Action for Canada, Save Canada, Concerned Citizens Canada, and a number of others. They have chosen libraries as a culture war battleground, and we are now suffering the ill effects of that decision. This has led to a huge increase in challenges. There were 331 challenges reported to us in the most recent 2-year period. That's compared to an average of 44 challenges per year in the previous 7 years. That's 167 challenges per year. That's almost 4 times the number of challenges per year. Sorry, 165.1 challenge or 0.5 challenges per year. These groups, not only have they been challenging folks, but they've been protesting libraries that have picked, and they have picked LGBTQ content as their pet issue. And so we've seen that category rise to the top. There have been a lot of major protests against pro-LGBTQ events, especially drag queen story times, vandalism to any sort of queer content or displays for Pride Month. This has been rampant across the country in the last couple of years. On the rest of this list, we see racism and sexually explicit content round out the top 3. But I want to just point out how much we have seen challenges to queer-phobic content drop. They're now at the bottom of our top contenders here as far as categories go. Now that we've looked at the numbers, I want to show you this chart that I think really illustrates what's happened a bit more. This lists the top 10 challenge types that we've experienced from this entire 9-year period. And as you can see, most of the variances between the 2 time periods we're talking about here are fairly minor, probably within the margin of error, except for this one specific one, challenges to pro-LGBTQ content. We do see the drop in challenges to queer-phobic content here as well. And I have an untested hypothesis on that. I think that perhaps this drop may be because of the amount of press and publicity that the anti-LGBTQ crowd has garnered in the past couple of years. I feel like it may be because this kind of library censorship has been in the conversation and there's been so much criticism of book banning attempts that others may be discouraged from challenging books. I'm optimistic that that may be the reason we've seen the drop in challenges to queer-phobic content, but I really don't have any data to back that statement up. But I hope it's the case. Now, I want to note that what I'm showing you here are nationwide results. And we all know that Quebec's social trends have not always aligned with the rest of the country. And in this case, they also happen. It's been a bit different in Quebec. Based on our reports, Quebec libraries did indeed report challenges to LGBTQ content at a somewhat lower rate than the rest of Canada, but it's still a massive rise from what the national rate was in the previous 7-year period. I don't really have numbers from Quebec specifically from the 2015 to 2021 time period, because in that time period, we received so few reports from Quebec because we didn't really have a lot of outreach to the province at that time. So there's not a statistically significant number there to begin with, so I can't really do a basis of comparison for you. It's also worth noting that that this rise in challenges to LGBTQ content has begun a little bit later in Quebec. In 2022, challenges to LGBTQ material only made up 20% of the challenges that we received from Quebec, 33% in 2023. So it seems like things are picking up in Quebec, and they're now at this point, they may be at the same rate as the rest of the country, but the province seemed to catch on to this trend a little bit later. Now, you may be thinking that this is a problem that you might see in small communities, some communities with some more generally conservative mindsets, maybe more opposed to LGBTQ materials and events in their libraries. Maybe it won't affect you if you're in a larger, more progressive city. Well, turns out you're wrong. It doesn't really matter where you live. This is happening everywhere. And this slide is very data heavy, so I'm just going to give you a really quick overview of what we're looking at. This chart shows percentage shares of all challenges and percentage shares of just anti-LGBTQ challenges over the 2 different time periods, separated into 5 demographic criteria. The red section covers 2015 to 2021. The yellow section covers 2022 to 2023. The columns I want to draw your attention here are the differential columns. These columns, these numbers represent the difference between the demographic categories percentage share of all challenges and the same categories percentage share of just the anti-LGBTQ challenges. And to illustrate that further, if we look at the top row in the 2015 to 2021 period, we see that communities with a younger median age generated 25.2% of all challenges, but only 4.5% of anti-LGBTQ challenges. That is a differential of minus 20.7 percentage points. And that means that young communities in that time period were very unlikely to challenge pro-LGBTQ materials. So I've highlighted specific cells on this chart that have a differential greater than 10 percentage points. If we look at the 2015 to 2021 section, we can see that there were quite a lot of community profiles where we'd see disproportionately higher low reporting rates of anti-LGBTQ materials or anti-LGBTQ challenges. But if you look over at 2022 to 23, the differentials are pretty flat. The only area that's slightly overrepresented is medium age group, and I don't really know if there's anything significant about that finding. It may just be noise. But I want to mention and I want to stress that the reason that we're seeing this sort of flat increase across the board in anti-LGBTQ sentiment is that a lot of the resistance is coming from outside of the libraries communities. The organizations that are spearheading this resistance are using social media to stir up dissent. They're organizing online, and in many cases, they are traveling to other communities to protest. I want to talk a bit about the qualitative data that we've collected. Over the last couple of years, there's been some very concerning terminology that has come up a lot in the challenges that we've seen. We're seeing a level of acrimony and vitriol that I think is probably unprecedented as far as reported challenges go. And I would say that in my opinion, and I'm not a lawyer, but it seems to me that based on the legal definition of hate speech, a lot of these complaints that we're seeing do sometimes cross the legal threshold to hate speech, and that's a pretty high bar. And that's especially because a lot of this resistance happens in public protests outside libraries, and so they are publicly broadcasting the speech that they're using, and that's why I think it probably many of these situations do end up crossing that line. We see the terms grooming, sexualization of children, child pornography. We see those come up a lot in the challenges. And this really brings to focus a long and shameful history of conflating non-heteronormative identities with pedophilia. We're seeing it especially in organized protests that drag these storytime events, but we're also seeing it come up a lot in challenges to books that aren't necessarily sexual in any way, but just have queer characters in them. They may not even be central queer characters. They could be peripheral queer characters, but it happens in a lot of book challenges as well. Several organizations have selectively cited the criminal code in order to get books banned for child pornography. And to that point, in February last year, the BC RCMP was called into the Chilliwack School District after a complaint was made in order to investigate a number of books in school libraries. And they had to waste their time doing this and then make a public announcement that these books were in fact not pornography, to no one's surprise. And we're also seeing something else that's very concerning. We're starting to see a rise in challenges to anti-racist books or content that was perceived to be anti-white. This is a big trend in the US right now, and it has been for quite a few years, but it hasn't been something that has really shown up in reported challenges in Canada up until this 2-year period. There were 5 challenges to materials that fit this category there. And these are often like coded with language like this book is divisive and will confuse children and will make them feel ashamed of who they are. The reason that I'm bringing this up is because there have been a number of libraries and school boards in the US who have received blanket challenges to books of this nature. And in a surprising number of cases, these books were removed. These decisions are often made by principals, superintendents, boards, and trustees who just don't want to deal with the political backlash of having these books in the library. And many of these books that are removed are entirely harmless, and I would say just generally socially beneficial. For example, May Among the Stars, which is a picture book about Mae Jemison, the first Black woman in space. It's a kid's picture book about this woman who went into space. It was banned and removed from a Virginia school library for apparently teaching critical race theory. And you may be aware that the book And Tango Makes Three is one of the most commonly challenged books in the US. We've gotten several challenges to it in Canada as well. And it's been removed from a number of school libraries. It's a kid's picture book about 2 male penguins who were given a chick to raise. And not only is there nothing sexual about it, it's not even about humans, and it's a true story. So I'm bringing all of this up because we in schools are particularly vulnerable to these attacks because our collections can be interfered with by our boards, our administrations, or other people who don't really have any investment in library practice or ethics. And sometimes we as school librarians don't really have a lot of options to fight back, especially if we want to stay secure in our jobs. But we have to consider the effect that this has on our students. If they see the books that represent their own identities removed from their libraries for being harmful, what does that tell them about their own identities? Especially when we're in high school, when we have students that are going through very, very difficult processes of discovering their own identities and discovering who they are themselves. And that's why these data are important. We can use the context that this data provides to help with policy creation for institutions. We can use it to help confirm our narrative and get external stakeholders on board. We know that this problem is going on, but without the data, we can't provide the necessary context for external stakeholders to understand the depth of the problem. And if we can show how widespread this problem is and the motivations for why certain marginalized groups are being targeted, we can use it to help us get external stakeholders on board, and this includes library boards, school boards, lawmakers. We can use the context this data provides to help with policy creations for our institutions, and that may, for one thing, assist library workers in going about their jobs, and it can help libraries themselves craft better policies tailored to these situations. And for example, the events of the last couple of years have convinced us at the Intellectual Freedom Committee to draft and send out a letter to a number of lawmakers, including some of our own MPs, as well as a few cabinet ministers, warning them of the rise of censorship attempts in libraries and schools, and specifically about proposed provincial legislation that supports this kind of library censorship. And we managed to get a few MPs, provincial and federal MPs, to make public statements supporting freedom to read. If we didn't have the numbers to back up our assertions, we may not have been able to make a convincing case on this. My next point about why these data are important is that these data provide a justification for intellectual freedom itself in libraries. And this is something that Michelle touched on when we were talking about the ick factor. So you may be aware that there's sort of a mostly academic split on whether intellectual freedom is actually socially beneficial and whether we should preserve it in libraries. And there are some library workers who believe that upholding intellectual freedom is contrary to creating an inclusive space for underserved communities. I strongly disagree with that notion. And a lot of that is backed up by this data. What our data shows is that marginalized communities are most likely to be victimized if the tenets of intellectual freedom are abandoned. My hope that by collecting and broadcasting our data, we're able to communicate this to the library community, resulting in policy and practice that will serve to protect and amplify the voices of vulnerable people. Lastly, how these data help is in professional support. By having all these data points publicly available, you can find support for your own censorship struggles by seeing how other libraries have dealt with similar issues. And if library organizations have a clear grasp of the struggles libraries are dealing with, the organizations, the provincial and OLA, QSLiN, CFLA, we can do a better job to tailor our resources to the needs of our communities. And this is where I ask you for your help. We as school librarians are fairly limited in what we can do as far as advocacy go, but we are not powerless. You can contribute to these efforts to preserve the freedom to read by simply reporting any intellectual freedom challenges you experience to the challenges database or via the ABPQ survey. What constitutes a challenge? This can be anything from a teacher, administrator, accident of a book, an email from a parent, or in the worst case, coordinated efforts and protests against materials and programs in your libraries. If you're in a position to do so, crafting district-wide library policies that include training on intellectual freedom and how to handle challenges is a huge bonus. This is something that's not often covered in library school or in teacher librarian programs, but it's a situation that is occurring more and more frequently in the reality of our lives as librarians. Next, you can share links to the database and information about challenge reporting with your colleagues and friends. Not everybody attends symposiums and conventions, and we still estimate that only about 40% of library workers know this resource exists, just as we showed in our poll at the beginning of my talk. If we can get the word out there, we can get a better, richer, more complete data set, and that's going to give us a much better idea of what's happening here. And the amount of data we have really helps us with our own communication, our own communication strategies. It helps get the word out to a wider audience. And lastly, if you have a passion for protecting your students' freedom to read, join the Intellectual Freedom Committee. We actually have 2 positions opening up in May. And if you are interested in taking an active role in these efforts, I encourage you to send your application materials into us. I'm the only school librarian on the committee right now, and given the nature of current events, we are actively looking for more school librarians. I'm sure many of you would make excellent candidates. So if you're interested in joining the committee or interested in any more information about this data, including some of the research that we've published on it and some of the social media items that we have, including graphics that illustrate the top 10 most challenged titles in Canada for each year, get in touch with me. You can reach me by email at my personal email address or at the IFC chair email address, or you can hit me up at LinkedIn. You can find me with this description: librarian, database specialist, and ex-opera singer, because even though there are like 5 Michael Nybys in the world, they're all on LinkedIn. So that's how you find me and not some guy in Finland. That's all I have for you today. And I'd like to pass this over to the eminent Anita Brooks Kirkland.
It's so nice to be here. I appreciate the invitation. And so here I am. I'm talking specifically about schools, and this has dominated my life over the past year or more. And I'm really, I want to focus on how we in school libraries can be proactive about this situation. I also have a few slides that deal with understanding certain aspects of it. Michelle and Michael have done such a great job of that, I'll maybe just adding a bit of color to that. I do want to ground what I have to say in the mission of school libraries, right? And what we have already accomplished over the past few years. The Ontario School Library Association did this fantastic advocacy campaign sharing school library joy. And, why do our kids experience joy in the library? Is it about finding just the right book without being judged? Is it seeing themselves represented in the collection? Is it that there's an open, welcoming, and safe space for everyone? And does that safe space allow them to, explore dangerous ideas, without without being censured on that. And, it's all of these things and more, but these things don't happen by accident. People who work in school libraries make these things happen, and these conditions exist for kids. So just, a little bit of reflection on the last few years. Canadian School Libraries runs our research symposium, which a few of you have attended, Treasure Mountain, Canada. And we had one in Winnipeg with the Manitoba School Library Association in 2017. And the theme of that symposium was culturally inclusive and responsive school library learning commons. And out of that, because TMC is always action oriented, we created this whole area of our CSL website on culturally relevant and responsive school library learning commons. And that includes this poster, which, by the way, is in 11 by 17 form, ready for you to print and post in your library. And gosh, wouldn't it be great to see this in every school library? And as far back then as 2017, we were talking about how it's time to make room in school libraries. We were talking about diverse collections, and we can't separate this discussion about book challenges and censorship from our thinking about cultural inclusion, I don't think. And when you reflect on the past few years since we started this initiative, gosh, just think of all of the things that have happened. It's been a period of brutal revelations about our past. The Canada 150 celebration, when all of a sudden we're realizing that, hey, Indigenous people don't necessarily see this as a positive thing, 150 years, and truth and reconciliation and learning all of the history that had been hidden from us about residential schools and the unmarked graves, the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, to say nothing of the social disruption of the pandemic. It's been quite the time. And, we'd made progress, but then all of a sudden, whoa, it seemed like out of nowhere. There's Michael referred to the Chilliwack situation. What a headline. What if to see school libraries, there's a charge against or an accusation that they're holding pornography, and the RCMP has to go in. That's kind of frightening, and there's major demonstrations outside of schools in Manitoba. And then bottom left there, the Waterloo Region Public School Board, from which I am happily retired, has had a major incident of challenges in which I've been involved. And there it is. This is how my life has been over the past year. And, I say I'm happily retired because, as Michael said, when you're employed in a school district, you are limited in how you can express yourself about these situations. But when you're retired, you actually get to say what you think, which is kind of nice. And, I've been interviewed by the CBC News and on CBC Talk Radio and a number of other talk radio things. There's an article in the Globe and Mail, Center for Free Expression, virtual forum, podcasts for educators, all sorts of things. Bottom left is, if you look in the tiny little box in the corner here, that's a video of me delegating to the Waterloo Region District School Board, speaking against a motion to censor access to e-books based on age appropriateness. And it was the second time I had delegated to the school board on related issues. And bottom right there, I am co-editor of the Canadian School Libraries Journal, and the spring edition last year of the journal had over half the articles dedicated to the issues around challenges and censorship, and we've continued to publish articles. So I just want to go through, and some of this is directly related to what Michael was saying. Interesting. I think it's quite interesting, the difference in trends in Canada and the United States. But I want to focus on this reason that's often given: unsuited, inappropriate for the age level, age inappropriate. The term age inappropriate has pretty much become code for other reasons for the challenge, right? So the American Library Association, this is all American data that I'm showing you. You know, they deconstruct those challenges. Somebody says it's because it's age inappropriate, but when they read the text of the email or the text of the challenge, then they're discovering that the person making the challenge considers any representation of LGBTQ plus characters as age inappropriate, right? So their definition of age appropriateness and ours as selectors of materials are quite different. And so when they analyzed that content in 2015, they discovered that, the vast majority of these challenges really seem to be more about resources that represented LGBTQ plus people or were by authors or were by or about people of color, which is, really alarming. In 2021, we're seeing basically the same kind of challenges. What really bothers me is that whole critical race theory one, which is real, and Michael referred to that. And of course, critical race theory is an academic framework for studying systemic racism. But of course, like so many things, it has been co-opted by the populist organizations to mean that it's a way of teaching history that portrays white people as the oppressors. And of course, poor, delicate white children, I'm sorry, I'm being a bit sarcastic here, shouldn't be exposed to things that's going to make them feel bad about their history. So then when they look at the actual subject content of banned materials, again, this is American, you can see that it's divided, the biggest categories are divided almost equally between LGBTQ plus themes, protagonists, etc., and people of color, which is very alarming. That sexual content is often a way of objecting to other things as well. And a prime example is one of the most challenged books right now is The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. And it's often cited as, because of sexual content, it does portray incest, when in fact, the grounds for the challenges seem to be the representation of the Black history in the United States. So Michael and I think Michelle both referred to organized groups. And PEN America has done a lot of work in identifying groups. I think you've likely all heard of Mums for Liberty, which is a large, very influential and very well-funded, like in the millions and millions of dollars in funding, group in the United States. And, there are groups in Canada, the most prominent being Action for Canada. And, they have adopted, they use actually the same materials, the same book lists as Mums for Liberty. It's just carbon copy pretty much. And as you can see, Action for Canada, sort of specializes in conspiracy theories. You can see the list on the speaker's notes there. So this is really what we're dealing with. The American Library Association has just published some stats from just very recently. And I think this is really important. The number of challenges, look at how they've increased the number of unique titles challenged over the past 3 years, which is staggering. But there's 4,200 unique titles, but 938 attempts recorded. And this is because what happens with these groups is they get these big lists of books and they just send them to school districts, even even if schools don't have those books in their collections, they're just these big lists that are published. And this is a very classic tactic that sort of goes around our, our past experiences of challenges. And just, while I'm talking, I'd be very interested if any of you or your school districts have actually received lists of books, and, maybe you want to comment on that in the chat. Michael talked about accusations of grooming, and this has had this whole movement has had a huge effect on education in general in the United States. You've likely heard of the Don't Say Gay law in Florida, and there are other states that have this, where it's now against the law for educators to even discuss gay or LGBTQ issues or any issues around sexuality. Music teachers are nervous about teaching jazz because of the history of jazz, because it's going to touch on the history of Black America. There's just, it's gotten to be a huge fear factor. And, here's a photo of a parents group protesting against a school. The accusations of grooming, I'll just, those delegations that I did to the school board, another delegate who was in favor of censoring on age appropriateness accused me of supporting grooming of children when I was delegating at that meeting. Michael referred to, these notices. Like there's been, especially in BC, early in all of this, British Columbia had a sexual orientation and gender identity curriculum, and many educators there received these notices that you can just download from the Action for Canada website, accusing them of criminal activity by providing pornography. And the CFLA did send out this notice members that said, no, it's not true, it's not real, and giving advice on what to do. Again, if you've received one, that would be really interesting. We have sort of touched on this whole idea of moral panic. This is, again, the CFLA had a virtual forum last year, and the speaker was Lucy Santos Green, and Joseph Jeffrey from CSL wrote an article about this presentation. And this whole thing about how this is happening in our society, some event, typically in this moral panic, it's sort of a social phenomenon that's well known. It sparks anxiety and hostility, and then the whole narrative becomes about fear. And it's disproportionate, the reality, the perception versus the reality. And it's volatile. It seems to come from nowhere. And, I love this. This is like the characters in Moral Panic. The folk devil, that's you and me, folks, because we're the ones that seem to be under attack in libraries. But the real reason, the real people who are under attack are people who advocate for LGBTQ rights and so on, right? So, the book and the library were the low-hanging fruit. I do want to emphasize that it's still a fringe movement, believe it or not, even though it's affecting us so much. United Against Book Bans in the United States did a survey, and they surveyed like across the political spectrum in the United States. What they collected did reveal that most people still oppose book bans. So I want to go on to what we can do about this situation. Canadian School Libraries, we just recently published this document, Foundations for School Library Learning Commons in Canada. And one of the areas in that document deal with our ethical responsibilities. So, and our ethical standards in school libraries are based on the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and again referring to CFLA's Statement on Intellectual Freedom and the Code of Ethics. Ethical standards, again, we have a section on human resources and management. So, in management, the ways that we the routines that we have around circulation and so on are designed to protect privacy, right? There's all different things. So I would refer you, I'm talking fast because I'm looking at the clock, but just to have a look at this, because there's some very practical ideas for how to manage the library and our responsibilities as people who work in libraries, and how we do things are based on the ethics of librarianship and of education, and just being intentional about how we do those things. And I wrote an article, this is my personal shout out for, I've written a few articles all around various topics like this, but I wrote one a while ago about, I called it Taming the Library Dragon, Mission, Ethics, and Library Routines. And, you know, I think sometimes we get very obsessive. Sometimes when we do that, we're actually infringing on their rights. The other thing that I want to refer you to is Canadian School Libraries Collection Diversity Toolkit, because we have to be continue to be proactive in developing diverse collections. I think it's really, really important. And we do have a section in there on guidelines and procedures, which we've heard referred to a few times. And a little shout out to the Ontario School Library Association, who recently published this guide to selection and deselection of school library resources. The intended audience there, it's like in Ontario, you know, I'm very familiar with Ontario. School boards are actually required to have selection guidelines and reconsideration procedures, yet many school districts don't. And, you know, it is your primary defense against all of this is to have proper guidelines and procedures. And OSLA's document really helps you to assess your guidelines or write them if you don't have them, and you should have them. We do have in our toolkit a little model for what kinds of things should be in a selection guideline. The first section deals with curriculum support, et cetera, but the bottom part talks about representation and diversity and all of those things that we need to consider. And I think it's really important for us to remember that when we're selecting resources based on sound criteria that support readers and learners, according to all of those ones at the top, we cannot reject an item because it represents diverse peoples. We would be actually infringing on the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms should we make that part of our selection criteria. And of course, it would contravene library ethics. Another thing about reconsideration procedures, first of all, when you receive a challenge to a book, most can be resolved informally, you know. Antango Makes 3. I handled a challenge to Antango Makes 3 a few years ago. And, you know, the school had sort of elevated it to me. The parent was not satisfied with the school's explanation. I was the library consultant at the time. But, you know, I was able to converse with this mother and help her to understand how she could deal with this with her children should issues come up, and convincing her that because she didn't want her children to read the book, she really didn't have the right to make that decision on behalf of other parents. And so, you know, it ended there. It did not go to a formal process. And so I think that's really important to remember. In Canada, boy, I'm going over time, but you know, there is legal precedence for decisions against, you know, protecting. This is a case where a teacher requested permission, because I guess he had to do that back then, to teach same-sex books that showed same-sex couples, and the Supreme Court of Canada said. The school board said, no, you can't. And the Supreme Court said, oh, yes, you can. It's your responsibility. Tolerance is always age appropriate. And here's a case in British Columbia where a teacher librarian went into a school and started removing LGBTQ books. This is sort of the exact opposite of what usually happens. And the administrator said, no, you can't do that. And the librarian went to the BC Human Rights Commission saying that this was an infringement of her religious freedom. And they said, well, that's, that doesn't have any merit. You have a professional responsibility. So, this is my call, like being the voice of reason in the school. And this is how all of us can be proactive. You don't have to be out there like me delegating and being interviewed, but we need to be knowledgeable. We need to know our professional practices. We need to be transparent, and I think you've heard both Michael and Michelle focus on that, and I think we need to help people to learn. We have a number of resources that give you our statement on book challenges is really recommendations for school districts. Again, the CSL Journal, we've got all sorts of articles, read what people are doing about it. We've heard about the Center for Free Expression and cooperation with CFLA on the challenges database and all sorts of other resources on that site. Fantastic. And the data, like I love this slide. This is, our friend Carol Cushlan, who, trolls Twitter. And this is a principal who posted that, they were working closely to purchase titles that were relevant and responsive. And, after they had bought all sorts of new resources, look at how their circulation statistics just went through the roof. Do it. Collect the data, show that this is important, ground our experiences on what is right for the child. A number of different ways that you can lead learning and create understanding. And I drew on this some from my own ideas, but also an article that Michelle wrote on Freedom to Read Week, and Lila Armstrong, who is a practicing teacher librarian who got money to lead professional learning for all of the teacher librarians in her school district, that talks about how we need to always focus on the rights of the child in this situation. And I did provide a little poll that, because I haven't left a whole lot of time for discussion and Q&A, but I'm hoping the poll can go up because I'm really interested in, this is one where you can check everything that applies, is what are you doing now, or what are you hoping to do about transparent practice and about leading learning in the school? Like, how are you helping other educators? Are you ready to help? Administrators, they're more driven by the fear of the challenge than they are. They just don't have the same context as we do. So if you wouldn't mind just checking every box of things that you've done or hope to do, I will say, in being transparent and applying programs. And we're already seeing quite a people who are running programs, doing displays, working with other libraries, doing community events. So I guess we'll keep that poll open because I think it does inform our Q&A. And again, you can contact me anytime, folks. I'm around. So I'm going to hand it back to Chelsea.
Thank you so much, Michelle, Michael, and Anita, for the fabulous information. I feel a lot better now, feeling like I have some tools in my pocket ready to take on a challenge. We do have, and I love the homework. This is my kind of homework. All of these resources you've given us, it's really helpful. We do have a question in the chat from Beverly. She asks, what are your thoughts on books being challenged because of authors' political and criminal lives?
So who wants to take that one on? I'll start with that. I just, who the author is and what they think is pretty much irrelevant, I think. And, you have to look at the merits of the resource in question. Goodness, I'm a musician. If I refuse to play music written by, composers who had, different views than mine, there'd be nothing much left to play, you know, and you know, there's lots of people who, you know, there's been an anti J.K. Rowling movement, you know, on social media because of some of her opinions and things that she's expressed. But gosh, I would hate to restrict access to the Harry Potter books based on those concerns.
To add to that, if I may, one thing that I think that is particularly a problematic about removing books because of the whatever's distasteful about the author themselves is that we're making assumptions about why a reader would want to read those books. There's a lot of people who may be interested in reading the views of somebody after they find out some sordid fact about them that has perhaps put them out of public favor, not necessarily because they like that person or because they agree with whatever sordid issues have come up about that person, because they want to see, is this hinted anywhere? You know, it may be for research purposes, it may be for curiosity, and we should never stifle that. And I think there's a lot of hubris in making the assumption that anybody who would go to read a book by, I don't know, Bill Cosby comes to mind, because I was just reading about a library in the United States that removed every single book by Bill Cosby after everything came out about him. It is very arrogant of us to assume that everybody who would go and read a Bill Cosby book now would do so because they support Bill Cosby and what he did. It's quite likely that you might want to read that Bill Cosby book because you're like, did I miss anything about him if he was doing this the entire time? That's why I would be interested in reading. And so I am not keen on banning books by disfavored authors. And just like Anita said with music, my previous career, I was an opera singer. I personally love the music of Richard Wagner. Richard Wagner was a virulent anti-Semite, and it doesn't really come up in his music. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about Wagner's anti-Semitism. But removing all of his music from the canon would be a great sin against art itself, because regardless of who Richard Wagner was, his music is absolutely brilliant, and I don't think anybody can argue with that. In addition, regardless of what views Richard Wagner has, his favorite conductor was a practicing Jew, and he actually had him premiere his opera Parsifal, which is the absolutely most Christian work that Wagner wrote. So there's nuance to that there too. So I am not for the banning of works by problematic authors.
I'll just say, I also think it depends on the intention behind your collection. We know that not every library collects every book. And, you know, in my earliest career, I was a cancer librarian at Princess Margaret Hospital. And so the intention behind my collection was to pull together books that would help our patients in their cancer journey and their healing. So we wouldn't, for example, collect books that differed in medical thinking from that medical community, or that was found to be have incorrect health information, that kind of thing. That doesn't mean that if a patient wanted access to it, they couldn't still get it, but I wasn't collecting that and putting it on my shelves because that was not part of my collection development policy. So I think it's less an issue of what do I put on the shelves and more just, can that book be accessed freely by someone through interlibrary loan or what have you? You know, yeah.
Could I just add to that, Michelle, because, you know, in many respects, that library was a special library for a special purpose. In many respects, school libraries are special libraries, right? You know, in a university library, for example, their mission is to have the access to the collective knowledge of mankind, because researchers who are studying, for example, cancer treatment, need to know the history of how it was treated in the past in order to inform their research. But in school libraries, that's not our mission. Our mission is to provide kids with up-to-date, accurate information to inform their learning, right? So understanding, you know, perspectives from the past, you know, in some ways is addressed in school library collections, but not mostly. You know, we don't want to have books on the shelf that represent Indigenous peoples as historical anachronisms. We want books on the shelf that tell the story of how we understand indigeneity today, right? Because that's our mission. So that was a long answer to that question. If there are more, you're not going to have any lunch, but Chelsea.
No, thank you for that. We do have another question. It has to do with the fictional classics and the terms used in the classics. The person who asked the question is specifically bringing up one that's beloved in Quebec. It's the Asterix books. There's an Asterix comic book called Asterix et les Indiens and Tintin en Amérique. It caused problems a while back in Ontario, apparently. And what about Roald Dahl as well, and how it's being rewritten in the UK? Should they be modified or a label added? That's coming from Renee, this question. Anybody?
I can address there's a couple of things. I mean, that's a loaded question. There's a lot of it's a fraught issue for sure. But I'm going to use different examples than Tintin and Asterix. But I want to bring my examples I want to bring up are The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and To Kill a Mockingbird. These books have been removed from a lot of libraries because of the presence of the N word in them. I feel like that is a severe case of missing the forest for the trees. Because if we are trying to understand anti-racism in our society, it's probably important to understand the history of anti-racism. These are two very important works of anti-racism for their times. And if we take them right out of the library and we don't talk about them, the way that this particular term is used and the context of it in these two books is not in a positive light. And if we remove that context, we remove certain really important historical narratives about why this term was so virulently offensive. And I am not happy with that. Now, as for Roald Dahl, I have an opinion on that. The modernization of Roald Dahl books, to me, I feel like is an attempt to make sure that his books remain relevant. There's some terminology and words that he uses in there that, you know, are by today's standards problematic. And I feel like what they're trying to do is update those books so that those terms are changed without really changing the content on the whole of those books. And like nothing in it is remotely as offensive as the N word. But the issue being, I think, is that if these books remain in the shape they are, a lot of educators would be like, don't really want to deal with the offensive language in there around like kids. So like, let's just look at something else. And these books will fall out of the canon. That, I think, is the motivation for the modernization of the Roald Dahl books. Whether or not you think that's justified and whether or not you think that is a valid reason is really up to you. I'm not making a judgment on it. But with that context in light, I think we can make a little bit more informed decision on whether or not what has been done to Dahl's books is a good thing, a bad thing, or a neutral thing.
Could I jump in there too? Because I was asked about the for crying out loud, the title just flew out. No,
or Asterix?
No. Oh, for heaven's sakes, To Kill a Mockingbird.
Okay, good.
I was just interviewed about it. And, you know, some school districts in Ontario are giving their teachers advice not to use that in classroom instruction. And I agree with that advice. You know, like when you're a teacher, you are selecting what you are going to, kids are required to read, and there's going to be discussion in the classroom. And the N word, you know, if you think in a classroom today, it's going to make a lot of students extremely uncomfortable. You know, in instructional practice, you know, having one book for the whole class is sort of a thing of the past in any case. There's more, you know, use of multiple texts. Teaching that within the historical context of how that issue has developed over time, I think is really important. But yes, it should be held in the school library collection, I think. It is a classic. It does help us understand how that has evolved. It is a current issue. If kids want to, are hearing about this controversy, they should be able to access the book. And just, I refer back to our collection diversity toolkit. We actually do have a section in the weeding part of that resource talking about weeding fiction. Okay, and what is a classic? What isn't a classic? How do we make decisions about things like these books that we've been mentioning, and and how we can base those weeding decisions on sound criteria and not use weeding as a vehicle for censorship in our collection. So I would refer you to that.
I've been crossing my fingers here because I want to bring up a point. Anita just touched on something that I think is a really important distinction. There's oftentimes a conflation between banning a book and removing a book from the library and replacing it on a school curricula with something else. By taking To Kill a Mockingbird out of the classroom curricula, you're not banning the book. It's still a classic. It's still available. Most classics aren't on the school curricula. It doesn't mean it exists. I am all for removing older classics from school curriculum and replacing them with more relevant newer classics, simply because they're going to speak to the children more when they're reading them.
Exactly.
To Kill a Mockingbird specifically has been replaced with The Hate U Give in a number of school districts, and I think that's a great choice. And that one, even though it is obviously being banned for anti-racist, just generally anti-racist sentiment that's in it, that one often gets challenged for vulgarity over anything else. And it's like, you have no idea how many books have the F word in them all over the place, but this is the one that's getting all of the challenges. But The Hate U Give is written in a very approachable language for younger children, and deals with, teenagers, and it deals with the kind of how racism is affecting the Black community today, not how it's affecting the Black community 70 years ago. And I think this whole idea of getting really upset when favorite classics are replaced on the school curriculum is freezing our understanding of literature in this mid 20th century aesthetic that does not speak to the students of this day and age. So yeah, remove it from the curriculum. Don't remove it from the library.
So, and I have to just add to that, as teachers, it's your job in the school library to help teachers find more up-to-date material. If they're looking at the Holocaust, the Diary of Anne Frank, there was a big thing in Peel, because the school weeded that. But there's all sorts of literature now, fictional literature that deals in the context of the Holocaust. And it's part of our job to draw that to teachers' attentions, because teachers, let's face it, I'm a teacher. I'm not dissing teachers. It's just part of the thing that, you go with what you know. And if I've been using a book successfully in my classroom for a number of years, I tend to want to continue using it. But, talking to the school librarian and they're saying, oh, did you see this book just came out? And, that's part of what you do. And, so yes, that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you for this interesting discussion. We are running over time, and I wish we could keep on talking because I really love hearing what you all have to say. There's one comment: teaching titles that students can connect to will go a long way with helping create lifelong readers. Yes. So true. Yeah, I must say, I want to shout out, there's a book I just read recently called Res Ball, and I'm forgetting the author, but the amount of swearing was so incredible. I was like, oh my gosh. But it got so many awards. It was so good, and it was an awesome sports basketball theme. I loved it, but I know it's going to shock people with the amount of swearing, but what a fantastic book. I hope teachers pick it up. I'm certainly going to. Of
course, kids have never heard swear words.
Oh, no. So thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today. I really appreciate your presence and your knowledge and being so willing for us to reach out to you if we have questions in the future. So thank you. And thank you to Joan Harrison for being our technical person. And thank you to all of our spectators, all of our attendees who came to listen. So appreciate
Thanks
it
for
very
inviting
much.
us.
Thank you.
Thank you. I was so happy to be here.
Oh, thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye-bye.